Hello everyone, today we address briefly the Swedish flags of the early modern age. Right, so as we have seen also from the other videos about Renaissance and early modern warfare, this was a period of substantial transformation of the European armed forces towards the model of a professional permanent army. Sweden, as actually important countries such as England, for example, albeit coming relatively late, in these developments, was also one of the most successful ones under the reign of King Gustavus Adolphus, who is remembered rightly and so as one of the greatest military geniuses in the history of warfare. A reformer, right? Not just a great commander, but also probably one of the most complete ones, right? A reformer, an innovator, right? A person that had a dramatic catalyzing role in the transformation of early modern warfare towards a more permanent, but at the same time also more professional, but also more dynamic and diversified military system. And it would be interesting to talk about it. Today we talk just about flags, right? So probably this is one of those videos that you say, oh, well, it sucks because, who cares about flags? But flags are actually important in their way. They're just a sort of, encyclopedical or gamistic reason for which I cover every single aspect, even if not in extreme detail, actually, because these are big topics, right? I've never been passionate excessively about, the most, the ultimate detail of flags, of uniforms, etc. But behind those details pass, in fact, important transformations. And today we will be looking at chiefly at we will talk about 16th and 17th century Sweden, but more specifically also about the so-called colored regiments, these mercenary regiments created and also developed, reinforced under the reign of King Gustavus Adolphus, right? As these were, we start getting essentially substantial amount of information about not just the uniforms, but in fact, probably the flags, right? And the modern national flag of Sweden was in fact introduced actually by Gustavus I, right, in the 16th century, Gustavus Vasa, and it may have sometimes have been carried by Swedish troops during the 16th century, right? It's important to stress here that during especially the second half of the 16th century, Sweden had attempted, a sort of reform of the militia system that hadn't probably been, so decisive for the later developments of Gustavus Adolphus in the first half of the 17th, but showed this broader vision of by that time of a modest power like Sweden to. However, under the unitary direction of the monarchy, they had managed also to emancipate from Denmark, from these interference that had, even the history of Sweden is frankly complicated in late Middle Ages. We'll have to cover it at one point, but it's very, very beautiful. It shows, as in the case of England, for example, under Charles I Stuart, this need that such countries had to reinforce for different reasons, actually, at least the national defense, right? That was Charles I's deal. Mainly was not completely about creating troops to ship overseas. Sweden, especially with Gustavus Adolphus, as we know, rises to dramatic power, right? As a perhaps at the end of and the tragic end of Gustavus Adolphus' life, Sweden was still medium power, but it's thanks to Gustavus Adolphus' reforms that the Swedish Empire would fundamentally developed at the end of the 30 Years' War, having this important avant-posts from the other side of the Baltic, and eventually, especially at the beginning of the 18th century, reaching under Charles XII. Actually the strongest army in Europe at that time. Then eventually, after Poltava, that the Swedish power faded once again. But these are later developments. So for now, we are interested mostly in this, first 2 centuries of the modern age. And it's interesting that the modern national flag of Sweden appeared as early in military use as the 16th century, but apparently not so in the 17th, right? The most common patterns in these 2 centuries were actually multicolored flags with stripes or geometrical patterns. Actually, as we will see later, the very first, at least preserved Swedish flag that we have is in fact with kind of a wavy striped pattern. And King John III, ruling between 1568 and 92, ordered that such flags had to carry a yellow cross as a national badge, right? Then lions, also the Scandinavian three-crown device, used since the 15th century, also appeared. This was, actually pretty widespread in Gustavus Adolphus' times as well. And in fact, the early Swedish military flag to have survived is the striped infantry, right? That dates back to essentially the 20s of the 17th century. It has the Swedish national flag colors, right? And it actually seems like this is important. It looks like the Dutch ones of the similar period. This is important because it shows you how in this moment where actually Gustavus Adolphus was moving the first steps in terms of the military reforms. Naturally, at the time it was mostly the Dutch experience, Maurice of Nassau's reforms, etc., that dictated, at least manualistically, theoretically, what the even things like flags had to be. Eventually, that the Swedish army got under Gustavus Adolphus got formed under this very tough school against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was a dramatic encounter, especially for the eventual revival of cavalry in Western Europe, right? The Polish winged hussars famously were a pretty tough nut to crack for Gustavus Adolphus, and that's where they were an anachronism of success actually at that point, and that's where he got among other things the intuition that cavalry could and had to be necessary in order to cope with such enemies, to be revived and eventually cooperating chiefly in also through a modification of the same infantry tactics that were progressing towards the so-called linear type, right, and kind of thinning the ranks of pikemen and broadening them, especially the front of muskets. Those muskets were Gustavus Adolphus actually did an enormous deal of things, and this is interesting because Sweden actually was pretty backwards up to that point, right? What strikes you is how in military history sometimes, and not just in that, it's widespread in the history of technology, how actually countries that arrive later are able to implement more easily and more effectively certain systems, exactly because they don't have the burden of a previous structure that can be contested in this regard. This doesn't mean that Gustavus Adolphus' reforms didn't come at a heavy cost, right? His greater achievement in quantitative perspective was the fact of raising finally a certain basically so-called provincial regiments. The Swedish domains were essentially divided in 8 districts that were to provide each own this regiment that eventually would have to go, even abroad to war. So you imagine the expenses, and especially, however, this is a characteristic of the army of this times, relying mostly on the professionals, mercenaries, mostly Germans, but also Scots and people also coming from other places. Sweden is, also quite large in influencing several countries, especially in the Baltic, for Finnish troops, Latvian troops, and so on. And he he modified. He for example, the Swedes still relied on their culverins, on their smaller arms, older arms also, and he introduced the musket. He even lightened up the existing models. He on a large scale, he even reformed the carriage systems for artillery transportation. He standardized the calibers. I mean, he did an enormous deal of stuff that was really procuring the times and inspiring eventually the later, Western, what would become later Western warfare. And we see in this context, especially during the 30 Years' War, blue and yellow and also orange and green infantry flags mentioned as carried by the Swedes, right? That could have been of the essentially of the Dutch type. What is fascinating, I've never read actually these sources, but the impression I get from many areas, especially of Northern and Eastern Europe, is that we still don't, first of all, we don't have many of the documents that issue all this stuff. We often rely on either contemporary historians or eyewitnesses during the battles, sometimes even actually the enemies of in this case of the Protestants, of the Swedes, that talk about how these guys basically looked, and we rely on that. We have a bit of watercolors, manuscripts showing, as we will see now, a bit of what this color should be, but we are not sure, for example, about the actual colors. Rather, they were. This is a problem also for previous centuries. Like, how did actually these flags look like, and how spread they were, and especially who did they belong to? Because there is no clarity, right? Sometimes we get confused. Did this banner was used by this colored regiment, for example, or was it one of the Swedish provincial ones? Sometimes we don't know. And under Gustavus, the common styles for infantry, Gustavus Adolphus, styles for infantry flags were a plain ground with a crown over either the royal arms or the royal monogram. Right, Gustavus would use famously GARS, G-A-R-S, that stands for Gustavus Adolphus Rex Suecia. That obviously means Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden. And such flags often, they could be very different actually. They often bore different mottos, such as, the Gustavus Adolphus Rex Fidei Evangelische Defensor, which also means Gustavus Adolphus, Defender, King, Defender of the Evangelic Faith. Right, this is all very important because the first half of the 17th century was definitely the most intense moment of confessional clashes, and during the 30 Years' War, in this properly European conflict, or European scale, continental scale war, actually the same war would make surpass confessional clashes, in the sense that the modern state would emerge, and religion became a bit of a fiction, not just because actually the freedom of religion was sanctioned at the end of the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire, but because we can easily see things like, for example, the French-Swedish alliance, right? France, most Catholic kingdom out there, the Swedes probably, but the most Protestant, right? But there was still this, of course, important, deep, symbolic, meaningful idea that every king now that was struggling to emerge from essentially still a medieval background in terms of political and institutional forms to rise also in virtue of his zeal for defense of his own faith. And at one point, even in an interconfessional competition for which, who was the most Catholic, right? Of course, Austria, the Habsburgs were feeling like one, but at this point, the ones of Spain. Also, France is major Catholic power and allies itself with the Protestants. And the same goes for Sweden, that at this point behaves like the champion of the evangelic faith, and yet being enemy naturally to many other Protestant powers out there. Other patterns in flags included, for example, a crown surmounted by a rose with the motto "Touch me not or you'll get burnt." In this case, I think we know it from a secondary source because we don't even know if it was written in Latin or in Swedish. And for example, also a red flag with a flame and with a figure of justice carrying sword and scales with the inscription "Pro Rege et Grege," that is, for the king and the herd, right? This sense, as if the king was even a pastor, ideally for his religious. In his religious role detached. Now it's important, especially among the Protestants, that this word hadn't quite a center per se, like the Catholics, reference to the Pope. Now, Protestant countries were fundamentally, emerging as in the universal vacuum, we can say, as defenders of the Protestant faith, but as autonomous rulers, as autonomous kingdoms that. They didn't, of course, accept the so-seen papist interference. There was another flag that showed the sun overshadowed by clouds with the motto "Sero sed serio," which in Latin means late but in earnest, right? That naturally shows also the conflictuality of the picture, right? So from darkness to light. And this, capacity to, redemption of a newborn, right, a new rise of Christ, and judging also by later practice, these flags were probably colonels' flags, right? Some of the most important ones. The colonels, in this sense, were essentially the rich men that invested in the various regiments that were created in Sweden, even as we've seen as foreigners, that many foreigners, is important. The 30 Years' War is, in fact, in the case of France or of Sweden, witnessing the rise of more central powers, but the majority, as you know, the continents were fundamentally still fighting either with companies or militias in a still kind of, I hate to say it, but say medieval, just to make you understand, broad system. So it was plenty of people coming from everywhere, even places that were not basically involved more in the 30 Years' War. For example, from the British Isles, right? Lots of Catholics and Protestants alike, and fighting this war because they were coming from the poorest areas of Europe, for the Celtic fringe. There was a lot of Scots in Swedish armies, in the Polish-Lithuanian armies, also in the Habsburgic ones. And the colonels were essentially the ones that had also, that gave this pinch of personalization to their companies, because they led themselves, right? And naturally with some, counter, something in exchange from the king in this regard. And therefore all this scum of Europe, like literally, because this is what we've made many videos about this, from these outcasts, from these emarginated, even criminals, etc., gathered to make a living in the army, even in this mostly, terrible war. Of 30 years in Germany that literally wiped out 1/3 of the local population, had it better, in fact, under the arms than in civilian life, right? And that probably, they were waiting for war to break out, also because looting was all over the place in this context. And the colonel decided, in fact, what the major flag had to be, and also the companies, as we will see now. In fact, especially the colored regiments initially were created, if I'm not wrong, by Gustavus Adolphus already from the 20s of the 17th, 20s, of course, of the 17th century. And eventually for the war in Germany, if this before during the wars in the East, etc., some were actually recruited from Poland, from Prussia, Polish Prussia, in the sense that Prussia was still, of course, a vassal of the Polish king. Namely, there are even Polish symbols to be found in these flags we'll see later, but even recruited from native Prussians, for example. So there's a bit of melange of these symbolisms, and eventually they were brought to these regiments were brought to the strength of 12 companies, right? And the colonels actually decided what every company's flag would look like, right? In the 1650s, Charles X introduced also a new system that was probably inspired by previous practice, for which the colonel's flag also had to be white, right? And we have a substantial amount of evidence about this. The colonel naturally was stationed in his own company, so this corresponded inside the regiment. So this corresponded also to sometimes we have sources telling us how much cloth it was needed, and if it was partitioned in 8, let's say 1/8 had to be white, then we know that that regiment, for example, had 8 companies, right? And we can't think that white cloth was used for the colonels one. The colonel's flag, however, had to bear for this reform the king's monogram or the Swedish arms, right? While the company flags in the provincial colors, were, as we have seen, selected in different ways. Also, we have an interesting amount of depiction also of cavalry flags that were small and square, usually, except for some dragoon guidons, right? And they were also more variable in general than the infantry ones. Also in cavalry flags we have the 3 crowns design. Others include a blue and orange flag with an arm holding a sword and the inscription "Si Deus pro nobis quis contra nos." That means if God is with us, who is against us, right? And this is naturally a pretty clear proclaim against the Catholics, the Catholic legitimacy to bear arms against the Protestants. And also a scepter crossed with a sword and the motto "Ensem gradius sceptrum temis ipsa gubernat," which in Latin means something like, basically war God rules over the sword, justice itself holds the spire. So also naturally this idea of justice, like a more rigid, and also more the Protestants were thought to be in the sense also more strict, morally speaking, more concentrated about the idea of justice, of uncompromising attitude, right? Gustavus Adolphus Court also carried a black and gold coronet, and other colors included blue and white, for example. That is to be found even in other regiments. For example, the Scottish ones that in fact bore this Anders cross, but this I think has nothing to do with this specifically. Then blue and red, red, white, blue, orange, yellow and green. There was a Protestant tendency for having this, variously colored. It was a bit of a fashion, right? Sweden was not even the first one to rise the so-called colored regiments. In Germany this had already been done, in Denmark too, and this is especially in fact in Protestant countries, and it's important because it naturally it's a bit of a symbolical thing, but it's functional to tactics, and it's not surprising actually that the Swedish army under Gustavus Adolphus is credited, let's say with some approximation, to be in fact the first army to introduce at least the modern concept of uniform properly. But the thing was much more gradual. Also other countries had adopted this system, but naturally issuing as a common color for the uniform color for the whole regiment has to primarily with also tactical reasons. That is, you must identify troops that at this point are becoming ever more mobile, right? And therefore also in the field must be recognized more easily. So there's a pretty practical reason, but also a psychological one. I think it shouldn't be overlooked, the fact that, you know, if you fight against an enemy who's so uniformed, right? You say, wow, these guys, you know, are going to die, and they even care about the way that they're dressed, right? They spend the money to do that, and it's just visually it must be more terrifying. Always bearing in mind that the concept of uniformity is very, very relative, especially, I don't know, after months of campaign where your clothes have basically decomposed, and you know, there is no uniform of sorts. So passing to the colored regiments, naturally their names derive from the color of their, chiefly of their flags. Actually, then they followed some uniformity in clothing, of course, and this started, as we've seen, from the 20s of the 17th century, where this was the first time in Sweden, at least for this large units. Up to this point, flags of 3 meters per 4 were usually employed in Sweden. And in order to weight this down, they were made of thin silk called kartek. Right, in 1621, instead was adopted the smaller 150-man company that basically introduced those Dutch-styled flags that we have talked about before. And the weight problem had been resolved by using, for these smaller flags, a stronger silk, taffeta. And this brought to even a lengthening, at least in the these flags now could have wider breadths for this reason than the earlier silks. Could wear out more easily, up to 100 centimeters, instead compared to basically 1/3 of it. And as we have seen before this time, also the typical Swedish flag used in war had this alternate narrow stripes, at least of 2 different colors. And with this new taffeta flags introduced in 1621, there was also the possibility of sew a flag of a single color, right? As the fabric at this point could elevate, just one piece, and also more elaborate designs on it. And this is possibly at least the reason why the Swedish national flag that, as we've seen, appeared in 16th century actually was not to be seen apparently in the 17th, because it was easier to build that pattern as a cross, right? And in this, other phases were more elaborate symbols, right, including the Swedish arms and the other, as we've seen, even the mottos, etc. The previous ones instead being fundamentally very, very basic, from following these simple geometric patterns. And after 1627, flags were basically 2 meters square, seemingly, and there was a general similarity also between all these various so-called colored infantry regiments, that whether they were blue, red, or green, they were basically created in the same years, those years, 1627, 1628. So they were probably created all at once in a set. This is important because it also reflects probably the way they were created all at once, with a clear vision, not just like a sum of previous units, right, or a reedition of them. As we will see later, however, it was possible for certain regiments that were basically wiped out in battle to be reconstituted with different flags, actually. And there are interesting sources. One is Möners, watercolors, right, that shows, for example, the Swedish occupation of Augsburg in Bavaria between 1632 and 1635, to the Swedish trust across Germany. So talking about the various regiments, the green one, for example, just to make you understand the difficulties we have in understanding how they looked. We do not have a specific reference to green uniforms for the green regiment, right? We don't have the sources for it, and there is an explanation for its color, right? That was issued by Gustavus Adolphus himself, and the origin of this regiment, who having basically adopted these troops into Swedish service for foreigners, decided to give this color by putting them among actually the three German regiments called respectively the red, the blue, and the yellow, and therefore naming this the Green Regiment, right? And there is actually a surviving account of the reception of the taffeta for 8 new flags, so for the 8 companies of the regiment by the regiment's new colonel, right, in July 1627, right? And 1/8 of the silk was white, so the thing we were saying before, to basically for separating the colonel's life standard, right? And also possibly, however, for other devices that could be sewn into the green field, even for the others. Then the Red Regiment was issued in 1627 with this new crimson taffeta flags, and later on in 1628 with one flag of red double taffeta. And the Red Regiment was seen at the bridge at Wittenberg on September the 13th, 1631, right, with the Swedish army, and we think it was quite likely the Red Regiment, because it basically showed this, let's say, flags, I suppose, in fact, 7 red, 1 white, and other 4 mixed red and white colors, right? And there is even a mention of the so-called German redcoats under the Red Regiment's colonel Herrenreiter, right, in June 1628, and again of redcoats in August 1630 under Hogendorf, that was the new colonel. We actually have good information about the Blue Regiment wearing actual blue uniform, multiple occasions in Prussia, for example, also 1628. Blue coats are, named in the Blue Regiment, and also the Imperial's description of the Swedish army made pretty clear that there was in fact a blue coat regiment at the battles of Breitenfeld and Lützen. And it's been even thought that these troops are not actually, at least these troops' flags have been are documented, were not of the mercenary Blue Regiment, but rather of a native Swedish unit, the New Blue Regiment, right? And there are some discrepancies, however, about this, especially for the number of the flags. So it's more likely that these were the German mercenary troops. Also, the Italian observer Deodati noted that at Lützen, the flags of this unit were so worn out, tattered, that basically the trophies sent to the emperor had a very few, but basically the staff remaining, right? Which naturally makes you understand even how just for the uniforms, even the flags could be worn out that easily through prolonged campaigns and combat. There was also another Blue Regiment, the so-called Old One, right, that was even involved at Lützen its officer also, was wounded in there, and that in fact was brought back up to strength the year after, and that is fairly well documented in detail about concerning its flags. And then there is the so-called Yellow Regiment. Gustavus Adolphus made his first Guards regiments with flags in his personal livery colors. They were yellow and black, and these were there were two basically. It was the old one and the new one, the Regiment, that were created respectively in 1621-22 and in May 1624, that received flags with yellow and black stripes. And from a couple of years afterwards, the other regiment began to be called the Yellow Regiment. And we have a first account of all yellow flags displayed by July 1627, right, when two companies received the new 2-meter square flags. Also in May 1630, two other companies were issued with the royal wardrobe, right, with similar yellow flags. And an observer watching the Swedish army crossing the bridge at Wittenberg on, as we recalled before, September the 13th, 1631, seems to have thought that the Yellow Regiment's flags were white, and in Mönner's watercolors, definitely the yellow is so pale that maybe at a distance they might have been, the flags might have been exchanged for white. However, it's also possible that given that the Yellow Regiment lost up to actually 7 flags at Lützen, right, and it also changed, also commanders at this point, there was a bit of a transformation. So actually Mönner's watercolors may have depicted also later replacements of a different color, right? Albeit another source, Kevin Hüller, records yellow flags for the regiment at Regensburg in July 1634. Right. Also, we have remembered before many Scottish mercenaries in the Swedish army who used, in fact, blue and white uniforms in the correct proportions of the Scottish flag, and the Ogier, a Scottish regiment in Prussia under the Swedes, with huge red flags in the corner, which there is a white cross of St. Andrew and blue fields, right? And these are eventually, in a few years, the same systems used in the English Civil War, right? So these troops it's actually famous, of Scottish veterans that fought in the English Civil War, having been in the 30 Years' War, and also under Swedish service. And there are even in the watercolors certain Tatar flags depicted as such. For example, Gustavus Adolphus veteran regiments over the years 1630-32. As we've seen before, if a regiment was wiped out, naturally it was reformed, and also the flag changed, flags properly. But as we've seen, there could be, sometimes even just shafts being used with, basically no cloth at all, which means that actually these flags were not were not changed, if not in case, in fact, of dramatic annihilation of the unit. For the rest, they keeping used as relics. As, however, I think even about all the pride and the affection that soldiers had towards the object per se. There was also Whitsom's Orange Regiment. That is the one that we were saying before, displaying certain devices that are similar to to some used in Poland. For example, the laurel wreath, right? That is typical of the Polish flags of the period, and this might have actually been painted by the regiment while being in Polish Prussia, where they were stationed in 1630. There are many other regiments, but for the sake of flags, there is, for example, Wilhelm Berts Old White Regiment, 1632. The flags are which are documented in a number of 10, including 3 complete ones, showing the Swedish king's initials, Gars, as we've seen before, and also the state and the dynastic emblems, including the Vasa with sheath, right? And the fact that they are 10 makes us think that was probably the 12th company sized type of regiment. Huval's regiment even had flags, but which we have just, I think, one surviving of the 16 from one of the 16 companies that made it, that altogether had actually to compose with the letters depicted on the flag in a row, Gustavus Adolphus Rex Suezorum, right? So this is fascinating because probably, yeah, in column and but also in battle line, they displayed this, in fact, this writing, and think about even this scenographic effect of this thing, and this naturally bears with itself the symbol of the posing affirmation of Gustavus' reforms and monarchic direction of the military organization. From Möher's paintings, we also have the only surviving example of native Swedish/Finnish infantry flags, right? There was even a Finnish regiment, probably one of Caspar Hermes, for example, that we know, that could display provincial arms and multiple colors. And there is, in fact, this source from Reginbaldus Möher, right, is fairly little known, depicting the various Swedish regimental flags in watercolor paintings that display that especially from the occupation of Augsburg from 1732 to 1635, and they're very nice because they also basically show the ingenious way for these for the regimental and company flags to display the same regimental motives, but still being, differentiating themselves from other minor details, and that is what we can get most of the this interesting details for. We also know of a mourning uniform, right, for the Swedish troops that accompanied Gustavus Adolphus' body for the state funeral in Stockholm in 1633, this regiments basically received black flags together with black uniforms, right? And these flags and uniforms might have been actually the ceremony was in 1634. The accompaniment was 1633. As you know, he died at the Battle of Lutzen. But these units kept wearing in black for a long time to come, actually, for stressing in fact the greatness of the sovereign that so much had contributed for the same creation of the Swedish army that eventually had partaken to the 30 Years' War and displayed some of the most so the greatest performance up to that point historically in modern warfare. So yeah, this is basically it. There would be a lot more to say naturally, and we still had, this is the first time actually we talk about the Swedish army in the early modern age. Actually, I think the first time ever, and yet we will have to to go deep in this because the army at least of Gustavus Adolphus is one of the most fascinating in military history, and therefore we'll get a bit more technical and tactical aside from just flags like we did today. So let's stop it here for now. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.